I let my best friend move in, temporarily. 3 months later, I realized he was quietly replacing me. I never planned on writing this. Honestly, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you my life was boring in the best possible way. Stable job, stable relationship, a small but tight circle of friends. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth turning into a cautionary tale. That changed the day I said, "Yeah, you can crash here for a bit." I've known Mark since college. We weren't inseparable back then, but we were close enough that if you asked either of us who our real friends were, we would have named each other without hesitation. We bonded over late-night study sessions, shared playlists, and the mutual understanding that neither of us really knew what we were doing with our lives yet. After graduation, we stayed in touch. Not constantly, but consistently. Birthdays, big life updates, occasional drinks when we were in the same city. Mark always had this way of making his problems sound temporary, like life was constantly just about to work out for him, a job that wasn't a great fit, an apartment situation that fell through, a relationship that ended out of nowhere. There was always a reason, always a next step. I never questioned it. I was doing okay for myself, not rich, not wildly successful, but stable. I had a decent apartment, a job that paid the bills without draining my soul, and a girlfriend I genuinely loved. We'd been together for a few years, talked casually about the future, nothing rushed. Life felt balanced. Then Mark called me one night, voice tight in that way that tells you something's wrong before the words even come out. He'd lost his job, again. This time it was unfair, political, not his fault. His landlord was selling the place. He had nowhere to go. He asked if he could stay with me for a couple of weeks, just until he figured things out. I didn't even hesitate. Of course he could stay. He was my friend. He needed help. I had the space. My girlfriend was supportive, even encouraging. "We want someone to help us if we were in that position," she said. The first few days were exactly what I expected. Mark slept a lot, watched TV, applied for jobs half-heartedly from his laptop at the kitchen table. We caught up late at night, talking about old memories, laughing about stupid things we'd done in college. It felt good to be useful, to be there for someone. The first week turned into the second. The second turned into the third. He stopped talking about timelines. When I casually asked how the job search was going, he'd shrug and say things like, "You know how it is," or "I'm being selective this time." I told myself not to push. He was stressed. Everyone moves at their own pace. Somewhere along the way, he stopped feeling like a guest. He rearranged things in the apartment without asking. Small stuff at first. Moving mugs, adjusting the thermostat, leaving his things in shared spaces like they'd always been there. He started inviting people over while I was at work. Friends of his I barely knew. When I came home, they'd be sitting on my couch like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't say anything. That was my first mistake. Mark had always been charismatic, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and make it feel lighter. My girlfriend liked him. Everyone did. He was funny, attentive, easy to talk to, sometimes too easy. I noticed he started texting her more than he used to. Nothing overt, just memes, random thoughts, inside jokes that seemed to form out of nowhere. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Then I started noticing how comfortable he was in my routines. He knew my schedule better than I did. He knew when I left for work, when I got home, when my girlfriend usually came over. He knew which nights I went to the gym, which weekends I was out of town. I didn't remember telling him most of this, but he knew it anyway. One night, I came home early unexpectedly. Mark and my girlfriend were in the kitchen, laughing, nothing inappropriate, nothing I could point to and say, "That's it." But the way the conversation stopped when I walked in made my stomach tighten. Just for a second, long enough to notice. "Hey," Mark said easily. "Didn't know you'd be home yet." Neither did I. I shrugged it off. I always did. Over the next few weeks, things shifted in ways that were hard to articulate. Mark started giving opinions about my life that felt strangely authoritative. He commented on my job, my schedule, even my relationship. "You work a lot," he said once casually. You don't really make time for her, he said another time. If I were you, I'd do things differently. He said it like advice, like concern, like he was looking out for me. My girlfriend started echoing some of the same sentiments, not accusingly, just gently, thoughtfully, as if these ideas had come to her naturally. I didn't connect the dots yet. I was too busy trying to be reasonable. There was a moment, small and stupid, that I think about now more than any other. I came home one evening and realized my favorite hoodie was missing. I asked Mark if he'd seen it. He smiled and said, "Oh yeah, I've been wearing that. Hope that's cool." It shouldn't have mattered. But something about it did. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, not just physically, but symbolically. Like he was slowly trying things on, seeing what fit, seeing what I'd let slide. And I let a lot slide. I didn't realize, until much later, that Mark wasn't just staying with me. He was studying me. At first, the changes were so subtle that even when I noticed them, I couldn't justify reacting to them. If you've ever lived with someone who isn't supposed to be living with you long-term, you know the feeling. You keep telling yourself it's temporary. You keep trying to be patient. You keep thinking, I don't want to be the jerk who makes a big deal out of small stuff. And because you're trying so hard to be reasonable, you end up ignoring the exact instincts that are trying to protect you. Mark started waking up earlier than he used to. When he first moved in, he slept until noon and wandered around half awake with a coffee like a house cat. But a month in, he'd be up before me sometimes, cooking eggs, humming, acting like he'd lived there forever. I'd walk into the kitchen and he'd already be in my spot by the counter, scrolling through his phone, perfectly comfortable. "Morning," he'd say, cheerful, like he'd done something productive just by existing. My girlfriend would come over and instantly relax the moment she saw him, like his presence made things easier. They'd talk while I got ready for work, laugh about something, share some story I wasn't fully included in. Whenever I joined in, the vibe shifted just a little, not in an obvious way, but in that slight dip you feel in your chest when you realize the room has its own current and you're suddenly swimming against it. I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to be the guy who gets jealous of his own friend. That sounded pathetic. That sounded insecure. Mark would have loved that word. He used it casually, like a tool. He'd say things like, "Don't overthink it," or "You're reading way too deep into things," in that calm tone that makes you feel embarrassed for even having a thought. At some point, Mark stopped applying for jobs in any visible way. His laptop would be open, sure, and he'd talk about opportunities and leads, but the urgency disappeared. It was like he'd found a new plan that didn't require him to leave. Whenever I brought up the idea of him getting his own place, he'd nod seriously and say, "Yeah, I'm working on it," and then pivot into some story about how the market was terrible, how everyone was underpaying, how he wasn't going to settle this time. Meanwhile, he started making my apartment feel less like mine. It wasn't one big thing. It was hundreds of small things. The kind you can't point to without sounding petty. His shoes by the door, always in the way. His laundry in the hamper, overflowing. His toiletries in the bathroom, spreading until my stuff was squeezed into the corner. His food in the fridge, but somehow my groceries vanished faster than usual. One day, I noticed he'd changed my streaming profiles. Not hacked them or anything, just rearranged them. My watch list was gone. My recommendations were different. When I asked about it, he laughed like it was nothing. "I fixed it," he said. "Your algorithm was trash." It was such a small thing, but it made my skin prickle. Not because of the streaming account, but because of the entitlement behind it. The confidence that his preference mattered more than mine in my own home. Then there was the social shift. Mark started having conversations with my neighbors, the kind I never bothered having beyond a polite hello. I'd come home and see him outside talking to the guy across the hall like they were old friends. He learned people's names, their schedules, their gossip. My neighbors started greeting him like he lived there. Sometimes they'd ask me questions about Mark, as if he were my roommate. "How's Mark doing?" "Mark said you guys might be looking at new places soon." "Mark mentioned you've been stressed lately." The last one hit me hard because I hadn't told anyone I was stressed. Not in detail. Certainly not in a way that would turn into casual hallway conversation. I confronted Mark about it that night, trying to keep my tone light. "Hey man," I said, "what's up with you telling people I'm stressed?" He looked at me like I'd asked why the sky was blue. "I'm not telling people anything," he said. "I'm just talking, it's normal." I asked him what he meant by normal. He shrugged. "Like when you live somewhere, you get to know people." When you live somewhere. I remember standing in my kitchen, hearing those words, feeling this weird vertigo, like my brain was trying to catch up to something my gut already understood. Mark wasn't acting like a guest. He was acting like he belonged there. And what scared me was how easily everyone seemed to accept it. The situation with my girlfriend got worse in the same slow, almost invisible way. She started coming over earlier, staying later. Sometimes I'd come home from work and find them already sitting together on the couch, watching something, eating takeout. Mark would greet me like I'd walked into their evening. "Hey man," he'd say, cheerful. "We ordered Thai, hope that's cool." Wei. At first, I felt guilty for even noticing how often she was talking to him. I tried to be the secure boyfriend. I tried to be mature. Mark was my friend. If anything, I should have been happy they got along. But then I started seeing little moments. The way she laughed at his jokes in a softer, more genuine way than she laughed at mine lately. The way he looked at her when he spoke, like he was measuring his words. The way she'd glance at him when I said something, like she was checking his reaction. It made me feel like the third person in my own relationship. When I tried to talk to her about it, she got defensive but not angry. Calm, reasonable, like she'd rehearsed. "You're being unfair," she said. "He's going through a hard time, he needs support, and he's your friend. Why would you make it weird?" Make it weird. That phrase stuck with me, because it implied that the weirdness was something I was creating, not something that was happening. After that, I started paying more attention, not obsessively, not like some detective, just noticing. And the more I noticed, the more unsettled I became. Mark started taking over small decisions. What we ate, what we watched, when we went out. If my girlfriend and I talked about weekend plans, Mark would somehow be included before I'd even invited him. "We should do brunch," my girlfriend would say. Mark would immediately jump in. "Oh yeah, I know this place." Or she'd mention a movie, and Mark would go, "I've been wanting to see that." Like that automatically made it a group event. I remember one night we were talking about going away for a weekend, just me and her. Nothing fancy, just a small trip. Mark was in the other room, and I assumed he wasn't paying attention. Later that night, he casually said, "So you guys are thinking of going out of town next weekend?" I paused. "Yeah, maybe." He nodded like he was processing logistics. "Cool, just let me know. I can figure out what I'm doing." What he's doing. Like my plans required his coordination. Like me leaving my own apartment was a disruption to him. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Mark didn't have a plan to leave. He had a plan to stay. And I was starting to wonder if the plan wasn't just to stay in my apartment, but to slide into my life. Once that thought took root, it was impossible to ignore. I started replaying the past few months in my head, not emotionally this time, but analytically. Like I was finally stepping back far enough to see the pattern instead of just the individual moments. And when I did, everything lined up in a way that made my stomach sink. Mark didn't just adapt to my life, he mirrored it. He started waking up when I woke up. He went to the gym when I went to the gym, sometimes even suggesting we go together again like we used to. He started dressing more like me, casual at first, then noticeably similar. Clothes I wore often, he suddenly owned versions of. The hoodie incident stopped feeling funny and started feeling symbolic. He mentioned things about me that I hadn't told him directly. Opinions I'd shared with my girlfriend in private. Frustrations I'd voiced quietly at night when I thought no one else was listening. He'd bring them up casually, like shared knowledge. At first, I thought my girlfriend was just venting to him because he was there. That explanation made sense. It was comfortable. It allowed me to avoid a much uglier possibility. But then there were moments where Mark would preempt me. I'd start telling her something, and he'd already know. Sometimes he'd even answer for me. "Oh yeah," he'd say, "you were really frustrated about that meeting last week." I'd pause, mid-sentence, wondering how he knew which meeting I meant. He never looked surprised when he got it right. That was when I realized Mark wasn't just talking to her. He was positioning himself. He framed himself as understanding, supportive, always available. He listened to her the same way he'd listened to me years earlier, leaning in, asking thoughtful questions, remembering details, validating feelings without challenging them, the exact traits that had made me trust him in the first place. Watching it happen felt surreal, like seeing a replay of my own past, except this time I was on the outside. I started to feel like a guest in my own apartment. I'd come home from work and sensed that conversations had already happened, decisions already made. They'd be laughing about something I'd missed, something that had clearly been going on for a while. When I tried to join in, I felt tolerated, included technically but not central. That feeling messes with you. It makes you question whether you're imagining exclusion or actually experiencing it. It makes you hesitate before speaking, second-guess your tone, wonder if you're being too much. And Mark knew that. He was subtle but not careless. He never crossed a line that could be pointed to definitively. No obvious flirting, no inappropriate comments, just proximity, familiarity, shared emotional space. If I brought up concerns, he responded with calm confusion. "What? Dude, I'm just being friendly." If I brought them up to my girlfriend, she framed it as compassion. "He's struggling," she'd say. "You know that. Don't make this harder than it already is." Harder for who? I started feeling like the villain in my own life. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find the apartment rearranged. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The couch angled differently, a lamp moved, a plant relocated, small improvements objectively, the place looked nicer. Mark was sitting on the couch, relaxed, like he'd just finished something productive. "Thought I'd freshen things up," he said. "It felt kind of cramped before." Before. I stood there, keys still in my hand, trying to figure out how to respond without sounding ungrateful or territorial or insane. I nodded slowly and said something neutral. Inside, though, something hardened. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how easy it had been for him to take up space, how natural everyone made it seem, how I'd been so focused on being accommodating that I'd stopped protecting anything that was mine. The next day, I decided to test something. I told Mark I'd be working late. I told my girlfriend the same thing. It wasn't a lie. I did have work. But I finished earlier than expected and came home quietly, deliberately, without texting anyone. When I opened the door, I heard voices. Not raised, not hushed, comfortable. They were in the living room, sitting close, not touching but close enough that it made my chest tighten. They were talking about me. Not in a cruel way. That would have been easier. They were talking about me like I wasn't there. Like I was a problem to be solved. "I just think he's stuck," my girlfriend was saying. "He overthinks everything. He doesn't realize how good he has it." Mark nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "Yeah, he's always been like that. He gets in his own way." I stood in the hallway, frozen. "He needs someone to challenge him," she continued, "not enable his anxiety." Mark's voice was calm, confident. "I've been trying to help with that." Help? I felt something drop inside me. Not heartbreak yet, not anger. Just the sudden, brutal clarity that I was no longer the main character in my own relationship. I stepped into the room, keys jingling louder than I meant them to. They both turned. The conversation stopped. That familiar silence settled in again, the one I'd felt before, the one that now had a name. Replacement. I asked them what they were talking about. My girlfriend hesitated. Mark didn't. "We were just talking," he said easily, "about life." Life. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just said I was tired and went to the bedroom. That night, I made a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I stopped pretending. I started watching Mark not as my friend, but as someone with intent. And once you see intent, you can't unsee it. That night, lying awake in my own bed while Mark slept down the hall like he belonged there, something finally settled in my chest. Not panic, not rage, certainty. I realized I'd been fighting the wrong battle the entire time. I wasn't competing with Mark. I wasn't even really in a conflict yet. I was being phased out. Slowly, quietly, in a way that, if I didn't act, would let everyone involved claim it just happened. Once I accepted that, everything became disturbingly clear. The next few days, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I acted normal, polite, almost detached. And in doing so, I saw things I'd been too emotionally involved to notice before. Mark stopped hiding. Not because he thought I knew, because he thought he'd already won. He stopped asking permission entirely. He used my things openly, my laptop charger, my speakers, my desk. He spoke to my girlfriend with a familiarity that bordered on intimate but always stopped just short of something undeniable. He gave her advice about her job, about her stress, about her doubts. He framed himself as the steady presence, the one who understood. And the scariest part, it was working. My girlfriend started treating me differently, subtly, like I was unreliable, like I was the one who needed managing. She'd double-check my plans, question my reactions, suggest I was being too sensitive when I withdrew. I realized then that Mark hadn't just inserted himself into my life. He'd reframed me. In his version of the story, I wasn't the supportive friend or the long-term partner. I was the obstacle, the stagnant one, the guy holding everyone back with his overthinking and discomfort. And that version of me was becoming real to the people around me. The moment that broke whatever hesitation I had left came on a random Tuesday. I came home from work early again. This time, I didn't try to be quiet. I walked in to find Mark sitting at my desk, my laptop open, typing. I froze. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't flinch. "Updating my resume," he said casually. "Your setup's better." My setup. My laptop. My files. I walked over and looked at the screen. He wasn't just using my laptop. He was logged into my account. Documents open, tabs I recognized, notes I'd written, things I'd never shared with him explicitly. That was the moment my patience finally snapped, not explosively, but completely. I told him to log out. He looked at me like I'd violated some unspoken agreement. "Relax," he said. I wasn't snooping. I told him to log out again. He did, slowly, almost theatrically, like he was humoring me. That night, after my girlfriend left, I sat alone and made a list. Not of grievances, of facts. Mark had no job. Mark had no lease. Mark contributed nothing financially. Mark was deeply embedded in my personal life. Mark spoke about me to others without my presence. Mark had positioned himself as an emotional authority in my relationship. And I had allowed all of it. That realization hurt more than anything else. Not because I blamed myself for his actions, but because I finally saw how passivity can look exactly like permission. The next morning, I told Mark we needed to talk. He smiled, like he always did when he thought things were under control. I told him he had 2 weeks to move out. The smile vanished. "What?" he said, genuinely shocked. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I told him the arrangement was over and the timeline wasn't negotiable. He tried every tactic. Confusion. Guilt. Anger. Mockery. He accused me of abandoning him, of being selfish, of choosing paranoia over friendship. He told me I was blowing things out of proportion, that I was ruining everything. I didn't engage. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The apartment felt quieter instantly, like a pressure I hadn't realized was there had finally lifted. The real fallout came after. My girlfriend didn't take it well. She said I'd handled it poorly, that I'd blindsided him, that I hadn't considered his situation. She said I'd changed. And for the first time in months, I didn't argue with her either. I asked her a simple question. Do you want to be with me, or with the version of me Mark been describing? She didn't answer right away. That pause told me everything. We broke up a week later. Not dramatically, not with screaming or tears, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had already shifted, and we'd been pretending otherwise. The aftermath was brutal in its own way. Mutual friends were confused, some took sides, some drifted away. Mark told his version of the story, of course. In it, he was the victim. I was unstable, territorial, insecure. I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long while, I trusted myself. Months later, I heard Mark had moved in with someone else. Another temporary situation, another fresh start, another life to slowly inhabit. I wasn't surprised. What I learned from all of this is something I wish I'd understood earlier. Some people don't invade your life aggressively. They do it politely. They blend in, they observe, they adapt. They wait for you to make space, and then they take more than you ever offered. And if you don't protect your boundaries, they'll convince everyone else you never deserved them. Letting someone stay is easy. Letting them leave is harder. But not nearly as hard as watching them replace you while you're still standing there, trying to be nice.